Hi, my name is Claire Hastings. For 10 years, I did everything a good wife is supposed to do in a place like Athens, Georgia. I packed Ben's lunches at 6 a.m., paid the utility bills when his wiring business ran dry, and smiled through holidays where his mother called me just Claire, never family. I refinanced our house in my name when the bank threatened foreclosure. I never once asked for credit. And then, the morning after I buried him, I turned my key in the front door, and it didn't turn back. I knocked, thinking maybe it was swollen from the cold. Judith opened it with a soft smile and said, "Honey, I just think it's time the house comes back to where it belongs." She meant them, not me. What they didn't know was that 3 years ago, when Ben got sick and the bills piled up, he signed something in that workshop of his. And he left me a note, just one line. It was enough to burn everything they thought they owned. Grief is heavy, but shame? Shame is heavier. And it sticks to your skin like Georgia humidity in February. I stood there on the porch in my funeral dress, hand frozen on the key. The lock didn't move. Not right, not even stiff, just foreign. Ben's truck was still in the driveway. The wind chimes I'd picked out at Hobby Lobby 2 summers ago were still swaying over the railing. But the house, my house, wouldn't let me in. I'm Claire Hastings. I'm 38. And for the last 10 years, I've been the kind of wife you don't notice until she's gone. I kept the fridge stocked. I drove Ben to every follow-up appointment when the heart meds started messing with his blood pressure. I refinanced the house in my name when the business dried up and the mortgage got scary. And I never once told his mother any of it. Because in Judith's world, wives don't save the day. They just serve the pie. I pressed the key in again. Twisted. Nothing. A porch light flicked on behind the door, and before I could knock, it opened. Judith. Hair fixed. Makeup done. Like she'd just stepped out of a church potluck. "Oh, Claire," she said softly, like I was the one showing up uninvited. "We didn't expect you back tonight. Thought maybe you'd stay with your sister." I don't have a sister, she knows that. Behind her, I saw the hallway runner rolled up. The coat rack was gone. In its place, a vase of lilies I'd never seen before. My jacket, the one Ben always called my tired lady coat, was missing from the hook. I came to get my things," I said. My voice cracked on things. Judith offered a half smile. One of those smiles people give when they're about to ruin your life politely. "Honey," she said, "Ben's gone. And this house was always part of the Hastings name. We just thought it was time it came back home." Came back home. Like I hadn't scrubbed those floors on my knees. Like I hadn't stayed up nights budgeting between electric bills and insulin copays. Like the dinner table hadn't once held a Christmas ham I bought with a Visa card I was still paying off. I didn't yell, didn't cry. I just stood there, breath caught in my chest, like it didn't belong to me anymore. Behind Judith, I could see her daughter, Emily, carrying in a box labeled Kitchen, China. My china. Our wedding set. Judith stepped aside just enough to shut the door between us. "Take a few days," she said gently, almost like it was mercy. "We'll figure everything out. It's just too soon for decisions." Then the door clicked shut, and the porch light went off. I sat in the car until the dashboard fogged over. Didn't turn the ignition. Didn't touch my phone. Just stared at the house. The house I'd held together with drywall tape, duct-sealed air vents, and hope. And suddenly, all I could think about was the drawer in Ben's workshop, the one under the old breaker box, where he used to keep manuals, warranty slips, and one brown envelope I hadn't touched in years. 3 years ago, when things got bad with the money, and Ben had his first fainting spell in the backyard, we sat at the kitchen table and made a plan. He signed a postnup, said it was just in case, told me I didn't have to read it. "I trust you," he'd said. Then he added, "But I don't trust Mom." That envelope was still in the house, still in that drawer. And I had no key, no rights, no place. Except, I still had my name on the title. At the Budget Inn off Route 129, the front desk girl slid me a plastic room key without making eye contact. "You need extra towels, just call down," she said. The room smelled like powdered lemon cleaner, and old smoke sealed into the curtains. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my phone. First call, Maya, my old roommate from college. She went into family law 5 years ago. I didn't even know if she still lived in Clark County. She picked up on the second ring. Claire? Hey, I said. I think I need to ask you something. About property law. I didn't sleep that night. I kept hearing Judith's voice. We just thought it was time it came back home. No, not this time. Not without a fight. Because what they didn't know, what they never thought to ask, was that I'd been protecting Ben from his family long before I had to protect myself from them. And now? I wasn't just the grieving widow. I was the legal owner of the house they were unpacking in, and tomorrow, I was going to take it back. The next morning, I parked 3 houses down. Didn't want them seeing me, not yet. Not until I knew what I was looking at. The sun was just coming up over the rooftops of Willow Bend, our quiet little development outside Athens. Same birdsong, same picket fences, same smell of pine mulch from the neighbors' flower beds, but nothing felt familiar anymore. I watched from inside my car as Judith came out the front door holding a tray of banana bread. She handed it to Mrs. Dyer across the street, with that same syrupy smile she wore at Ben's memorial. Like she was the widow, like the grief was hers to perform. I'd barely slept. The motel pillow was thin and smelled like someone else's perfume. Still, I'd spent hours replaying everything. Every conversation. Every moment I'd kept my mouth shut when Judith made those subtle digs. Oh, Claire doesn't cook like we do. Bless her heart, she means well. But yesterday proved it. They never saw me as part of this family. I was just renting space in Ben's life. And now that he was gone, they were repossessing it. At 9:12 a.m., Emily pulled up in a silver SUV. She stepped out with a case of paper towels and a big white bin labeled guest bath. My guest bath. The one I'd repainted pale blue last summer when Ben said the old wallpaper made the room feel like a gas station. She propped the bin against her hip and hit the keypad on the front door. 4 digits. Click. Entry granted. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my fingers hurt. They didn't even ask me for the code. Didn't ask if I had plans. Didn't ask if I was okay. By 11 high, the driveway was full. A moving truck I didn't recognize. Men in blue polos unloading boxes marked Judith, Master, and Emily, Closet. That one hit. Harder than I expected. They weren't just staying a few nights. They were moving in. Into the life I held together with sheer willpower when Ben could barely stand up without coughing. 3 years ago, I took out a second mortgage behind closed doors. I signed the papers on the same day Ben got dizzy on the steps and told me he was just tired. I never told Judith. Didn't want her opinion. Didn't want her pity. I used the money to pay off credit cards, fix the roof, and keep Ben's medical debt from eating us alive. I paid for the damn house. And now they were sorting sweaters in my bedroom closet. I finally drove off when Judith waved goodbye to the movers like it was her Sunday bridge group. Went to a diner on the edge of town. Place Ben and I used to get pancakes when he felt strong enough to go out. I ordered coffee and toast, but barely touched it. My phone buzzed at 1:36 p.m. Text from Maya. Meet me tomorrow morning at the firm. Bring the envelope if you have it. We'll start there. That night, I walked back through old photo folders on my laptop. Photos I'd forgotten existed. Ben with his arm around me at the lake. Ben building the patio table. Ben asleep in the recliner with the dog on his chest. And then one I hadn't seen in years. A shot of the living room, just after we painted it warm white. On the coffee table was the brown envelope. I remembered that day. He told me, if something ever happens, I don't want Mom deciding what's yours. But he never said it in front of her. Never challenged her. Never asked her to accept me. So I stayed silent. Because that's what Southern women do, right? We endure. We bake the pie. We make the calls. We don't make waves. But now they were swimming in everything I built and calling it theirs. I stared at the motel ceiling until 2 a.m. lit only by the glow of the microwave clock and the blinking smoke detector. I kept thinking, what if I'd pushed back earlier? What if I'd said no more Sunday dinners until she called me her daughter-in-law? What if I'd made noise before the door locked behind me? But shame is a quiet thing. It teaches you that peace comes from disappearing. I'm not disappearing anymore. Because this isn't just about a house. It's about everything I gave that no one saw, and everything they think they can take. Because I didn't scream loud enough. Tomorrow, I go back. Not to knock. To enter. I'm not asking permission. I'm taking back the proof that I mattered. And when I walk into that house again, I'm not walking in as the widow. I'm walking in as the one who owns the deed. I wasn't grieving anymore. I was planning. The motel light buzzed above the mirror, like it was trying to die and couldn't. Room 8 smelled like lemon cleaner, fried food, and something older underneath. Still better than the silence in that house. The house I'd built. The house I was shut out of. I sat cross-legged on the stiff comforter. That brown envelope burned into my memory. 3 drawers down in Ben's workshop, bottom right, behind the drill batteries and a cracked tape measure. I had one goal: get back in, get that document, prove I didn't just exist. I belonged. At 8:42 a.m., I walked into Carter and Bell, the firm Maya worked at. We hadn't spoken in nearly 2 years, but when I called, she didn't hesitate. The receptionist gave me a side glance, that subtle kind of southern judgment that doesn't say much, but means plenty. Grieving widow in a stretched-out cardigan. No makeup. Eyes red from motel sleep. She pointed me down the hallway. Last door on the left. Maya stood when I walked in. Still had that same energy. Smart, fast, no nonsense. The kind of woman who always had extra pens in her purse and knew exactly when to use silence instead of words. She hugged me like we hadn't skipped time. Then she said, "Okay, start from the beginning, leave nothing out." I told her everything. The locks, Judith's smile, Emily's storage bins in my closet, the vase of lilies, and the post-nup, still hidden in that drawer. Maya listened without interrupting, just nodded and scribbled on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she said, "They're building a narrative, that you were temporary, decorative, optional." She circled one word on the paper 3 times. Property. "If we can prove the post-nup exists, and it was signed with full mental capacity," she said, "you're not just his widow. You're the legal heir. You don't just get a piece. You get all of it." All of it. The house, the garage, the land we talked about building a shed on. But I didn't care about assets. I cared about being seen. They wanted me invisible. They wanted me forgettable. I walked out of that office with a folder full of Georgia probate codes and Maya's personal cell number. She'd file a motion by Friday, a legal freeze. No one could sell or transfer anything until we presented the documents. But first, I had to get them. That night, back at the motel, I watched the minutes on the microwave clock crawl past. I kept thinking about the sound of the lock when Judith shut the door. The way it clicked like punctuation, like a period at the end of a sentence that wasn't mine. I waited until 10:30 p.m. Judith was always in bed by 10. Emily stayed up later, but she'd usually plug in headphones and scroll her tablet. That was her pattern when she stayed with us the week Ben was released from the hospital. Back then, she offered to lighten the load. She washed 1 dish, then took 3 selfies with the casserole she didn't make. I parked 3 houses over again, wore black sneakers, no jewelry, no sound. Slipped through the side gate, the one that always stuck unless you lifted while pulling. Ben and I never fixed it. He said it added character. The side door opened with my old key, not the front, the one by the laundry room that no one ever remembered to relock. The air inside hit me hard. Lavender plug-ins, a hint of lemon pine sol. But under that? My life, still lingering in the floorboards. I didn't turn on the lights. Slipped past the kitchen where they'd moved the coffee pot to the other counter. Past the hallway where Ben's cane used to lean against the wall. The workshop door creaked. I held my breath, then shut it slowly behind me. The drawer was still there. My hands shook as I pulled it open. Under old extension cords, I found it. Brown envelope. No label. Thick. I knew the feel of it before I saw it. Inside, 2 notarized pages. His signature. My name, dates, witnesses, and 1 post-it note. Ben's handwriting. If Mom pulls anything, this will protect you. I didn't cry. I couldn't. Because that note was love. Too late to say it out loud. But loud enough to hear now. I tucked it inside my jacket, closed the drawer, and just as I turned toward the door, I heard footsteps. Soft. Bare. Moving across the kitchen tiles. I didn't breathe. Not for 5 whole seconds. The hallway light flicked on. A silhouette stood at the end. Emily. Holding a glass of water, eyes puffy, hair tied up. She froze. Claire? I stepped out of the shadows. Didn't say a word. Just held the envelope against my chest. She opened her mouth. Then shut it. Then, she stepped aside. I walked past her, back out the side door, closed it behind me without looking back. No yelling, no explanation, just truth, carried in a jacket pocket. Back in the motel room, I locked the door and slid the envelope under the mattress. Then I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my reflection in the dark TV screen. And I realized she didn't stop me, which means she knows what they did is wrong. She didn't stop me. That's the part I couldn't shake. Emily saw me standing in the house they took from me, and she stepped aside. No questions, no excuses, just silence. That silence said more than any apology ever could. Back at the motel, I lay awake with the envelope tucked under the mattress, heart still pounding from the break-in that didn't become a confrontation. I kept repeating Ben's note in my head. If Mom pulls anything, this will protect you. He knew. All along, he knew what she was capable of. The next morning, I brought the envelope to Maya. We sat in her office again, blinds half drawn, the smell of cheap coffee floating in from the hallway. I handed her the envelope without a word. She slid the pages out, read the terms once. Then again. Her brows furrowed. Then she looked up. It's valid, she said. Quiet, direct, no hesitation. Legally, this house belongs to you. It should have felt like a victory. But I didn't feel anything at all. Just a strange, hollow ache where relief was supposed to go. I'd been holding my breath for so long, I forgot what air felt like. Maya started scanning copies, attaching them to emails. Her assistant filed the petition for a temporary freeze, a motion to bar Judith or Emily from selling, leasing, or altering the property. By Friday, the court would review it. Until then, it was still war. But now I had armor. I left the office holding a manila folder, with my name typed clean at the top. Claire Hastings, owner of 213 Larkspur Drive. I drove straight to the courthouse. Clark County was always too quiet. A brick building that smelled like old wood and paperwork. The clerk behind the desk looked like someone who had seen one too many family estate fights play out in real time. When I handed her the freeze paperwork, she barely blinked. Name of opposing party? She asked. Judith Hastings. My voice was steady. She's my mother-in-law. The clerk nodded. Didn't ask more, just stamped the file. Court date will be posted within 3 business days. I stood there for a second longer than I needed to, not because I was scared, because I wasn't. On the way back to the motel, I stopped at the gas station, bought a bottle of iced tea, and for the first time in a week, I didn't feel like someone was going to tap me on the shoulder and take everything away. That night, I pulled out Ben's note again. The handwriting was rough. He'd written it during a flare, shaky hands, tired breath, eyes heavy from meds. But it was his. His words, his warning, his care. A kind of love he wasn't always able to say out loud, but left in ink. I kept the envelope by my side like a security blanket, because this wasn't about the house. It never was. It was about proof. Proof that I mattered to someone, that I wasn't crazy, that I hadn't imagined the years I gave to a family who never claimed me. The next morning, I drove past the house again. Judith's car was gone. Emily's SUV was parked crooked in the driveway. I pulled up slow, heart ticking like a second hand on a bad clock. I knocked this time, not to beg, to deliver. Emily opened the door. No makeup, hoodie, hair up. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her eyes flicked to the folder in my hand. I didn't wait for her to speak. "I'm filing for full possession," I said. "This is a legal freeze. No one can move anything, sell anything, change anything." Emily nodded. Didn't fight, didn't argue. "I figured," she said. Her voice was quiet. Then she stepped back. "Let me in." The house smelled different again, like rosemary candles, and change. I walked through slowly. The pictures on the walls had been rearranged. My wedding photo was gone, but the mark from where it had hung was still there. A sun-bleached square of proof. They could remove the frame, but not the imprint. I stopped at the dining table. The table Ben and I bought second-hand. The one we sanded down together, laughing over splinters and too strong stain. Emily stood behind me, then said something I didn't expect. "Mom said you'd leave quietly." I turned, met her eyes. "I did, once." Pause. "But I'm not doing it again." She nodded. Like maybe, just maybe, she'd always known that was wrong. Before I left, I picked up a mug from the kitchen counter. It was one of mine, white ceramic, a small chip in the rim. Ben used to drink his coffee from it every morning, even after I bought a new set. He said it felt broken just right. I carried it out with me, didn't ask, didn't explain. Because this time, I didn't need permission. Back at the motel, I placed the mug on the nightstand, sat beside it, watched the light fade across its chipped edge. They thought I'd vanish. That grief would mute me. That silence meant surrender. But they forgot something. I still had the folder. And that folder held more than paper. It held a reckoning. The folder sat on the passenger seat like a loaded gun. Not dramatic, just heavy. Like it knew what was coming. I pulled into the Clark County Courthouse parking lot 10 minutes early, parked under a sycamore tree that hadn't bloomed since Ben died, and stared at the building like it might swallow me whole. But this time, I wasn't walking in scared. I was walking in named. The courthouse smelled like paper and resignation, a waiting room for families unraveling in slow motion. Maya met me at the steps. She wore a dark navy suit and a tight ponytail that said, "Not today." She nodded at the folder. "Still got it?" I lifted it from my bag. "Still mine." Inside, we passed two other families waiting on inheritance disputes. One looked like they hadn't spoken in 10 years. The other looked like they'd never stop yelling. I didn't want to be either. I just wanted the truth to matter more than their story. Judith arrived 6 minutes late. Emily walked beside her, looking anywhere but at me. Judith wore black again, same dress from Ben's service, like grief was her costume. Her attorney, Mr. Langley, looked like a man used to winning by sounding reasonable. But today, even his smile seemed tight. "Claire," Judith said softly, her voice soaked in performative sadness. "We didn't want it to come to this." My hands stayed steady. I didn't want any of this. Pause. "But you changed the locks." She blinked. Didn't answer. We were called in. The judge was a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a plain gray tie. He glanced at the case summary and sighed like he'd seen it all before. Maybe he had, but he hadn't seen me. Not yet. Maya opened. She was calm, precise, stated the facts like they were bricks being laid in a clean row. Ben's declining health, Claire's financial support, the post-nuptial agreement, the signature, the note. She didn't dramatize it, didn't need to. Truth doesn't yell, it just stands there and waits. Langley objected to the document's timing. He said Ben wasn't of sound mind. He hinted that I pressured him. Judith nodded solemnly, like the suggestion didn't break her own son's memory into pieces. I didn't flinch, didn't speak. Maya slid a sealed letter across the table. The judge opened it, scanned, then read aloud. Neurologist report confirming cognitive clarity at the time of the post-nup. Dated and signed with 2 staff witnesses. Silence. Langley cleared his throat. Judith sat back. Her hands clenched her purse like it held what was left of her pride. Then came the judge's words. Measured. Clear. This court finds the agreement legally valid and enforceable. The property in question remains under the sole ownership of Mrs. Claire Hastings. Just like that. No applause, no drama, just a verdict. And a shifting of weight that I finally didn't have to carry alone. Judith didn't say a word as we left. Not one. Emily stayed back as her mother walked ahead. She paused at the door. Looked back. I didn't know, she said. I met her eyes. Flat. Honest. You didn't ask. Maya and I stepped into the sunlight like survivors. She grinned for the first time all morning. Want to celebrate? I shook my head. I just want to go home. The house looked the same on the outside. Same siding, same porch swing. But it wasn't the same house I left, because I wasn't the same woman walking back in. I unlocked the door. My key turned. This time, it welcomed me. The hallway was quiet. No boxes, no voices. I walked through slowly, taking it in like a witness to my own life. The rug was gone, but the scuff marks from Ben's boots were still there beneath the coat rack, like he'd never left. In the kitchen, a sticky note had been left on the counter. From Emily, it said, "Took our things, left yours. I won't be back." That was it. No apology, no defense, just an ending. Or maybe a start. I poured myself a glass of water, sat at the table, the one we built together. It wobbled slightly. Always had. Ben used to joke it was the most honest table in the South, because it leaned a little, but it never fell. I leaned back, let myself feel everything. The loss, the relief, the fury that still bubbled beneath the calm. They tried to strip me of more than a house. They tried to rewrite me, and I almost let them. Almost. But grief is not erasure, and silence is not surrender. I didn't cry. I just sat there, quiet, steady, breathing in the space they thought they could take. And then I noticed it. A letter, tucked under the garden journal in the living room drawer. Addressed to me, in Judith's handwriting. I didn't open it. Not yet. Some stories deserve to stay unread, at least for a while. The letter from Judith sat untouched on the kitchen table for 2 days. Still sealed. Still heavy. I didn't open it. Not because I was scared of what it said, but because I already knew what it wouldn't. It wouldn't say, "I'm sorry." It wouldn't say, "You mattered." And it definitely wouldn't say, "You were right." On the 3rd morning, I placed it in the bottom drawer of Ben's garden journal, under seed packets and a receipt for a bag of topsoil we never used. Let it stay buried. Some words don't deserve sunlight. The funeral had already passed. The one I paid for. The one I planned alone, after Judith's legal ambush. But a few of Ben's college friends had reached out. Folks from Atlanta who missed the memorial. Said they wanted to gather and say something real. Something clean. So we agreed on a Sunday. No pulpit, no pews. Just a small gathering under the old magnolia tree at the back of the house, near the shed Ben never got to finish. I set out chairs, made lemonade from scratch, the way Ben liked it, extra tart. Laid out a few photos on the back table. Us at the lake. Him holding our old golden retriever. A blurry one of him smiling at me like I'd hung the moon. The first car pulled in around 1:30. Then another. And another. Folks hugged me gently, like I might break. I didn't. Not anymore. Then I saw her. Judith. Hair pulled back, black blouse, pearls. Emily trailing behind with a casserole dish like this was a holiday. I stood still. Watched her step into the backyard with the kind of confidence that only entitlement can wear. She walked right up to the photo table, placed a frame of her own beside mine. A childhood shot of Ben in a Little League uniform. She didn't ask, didn't speak, just inserted herself like she always had. I took a slow breath, not out of panic, but to make room for what had to come next. I stepped in front of her, looked her square in the eye. "You're not welcome here." Her eyes narrowed, but her mouth stayed calm, like she'd been waiting for this confrontation or counting on me to avoid it. "This is my son," she said softly, a practiced softness, a public softness. "He was also my husband," I replied. And you've already taken more from me than anyone ever had the right to." A hush fell over the backyard. Conversations stopped. Chairs shifted. Judith held her smile like a weapon. "I didn't come to fight, Claire. I came to honor him." I shook my head. "No, you came to perform. You had your stage in court. This space, this day, is mine." Her face didn't change, but her eyes blinked a little too fast. Not out of sadness, out of exposure. She wasn't used to being seen without a script. Emily stood behind her, gripping the dish tighter. Her eyes flicked to mine, then to the ground. She knew. I turned to the guests, raised my voice, but not with force, just enough to be heard. "This gathering is for the people Ben chose, the people who showed up when things got hard. If that's not you, please leave." Judith stared at me, for once, speechless. Then she turned, walked out of the yard with her spine stiff as marble. Emily followed, silent, left the casserole on the table like a peace offering too stale to swallow. I didn't watch them go. Didn't need to. The moment wasn't about them. It was about standing in the place I almost surrendered, choosing to stay visible, whole. After they left, the space shifted, like the air let out a breath it had been holding for too long. We shared stories, laughed a little, cried without shame. Ben would have liked it. Simple, honest, no guilt furniture. Later, after everyone had gone, I sat in the metal chair nearest the tree. The sun was low. The yard smelled like grass and new beginnings. I poured myself one last glass of lemonade, held it up to the wind, and said softly, "I kept the house, Ben. But more than that, I kept me." A silence followed that felt like completion. Not closure, but clarity. Then I looked down. The casserole dish was still there, covered in foil, untouched. I lifted the corner. Inside, nestled in the food, was a folded sheet of paper. Typed. Just one line. "This doesn't change what you did." No signature. But I didn't need one. Judith had left her final word, still trying to rewrite the ending. But this wasn't her story anymore. It was mine. And the next chapter? It wasn't going to include her. "This doesn't change what you did." That's what the note said. Tucked under foil, between spoonfuls of green bean casserole. Judith's last line. Her closing argument. Even now, she had to write the last word. I held it in my hand the next morning, sitting in the kitchen with my coffee cooling beside me. Typed. Double-spaced. No name at the bottom. Just that one sentence. Still trying to stain something I had cleaned. Still trying to reframe the story, like truth was just a matter of tone. I stared at it a long time. Not because I didn't know how to respond, but because I knew I wouldn't. Not anymore. Judith used guilt the way most folks use sugar. Sprinkled into everything, just enough to make it go down smooth. And for years, I'd swallowed it. Told myself it was Southern tradition, family dynamics, deference. But now I saw it for what it was. Emotional erosion. I folded the paper once, then again, slid it into the back pocket of my jeans, and went outside. The garden was quiet, early spring sun. No birds yet, just a few ants wandering around like they were still figuring out where to start. Ben's raised beds were untouched. He'd spent hours out there, digging with cheap gloves and a quiet kind of joy. He never grew much. Tomatoes, a few peppers. But he loved the possibility of it, planting something with the faith it might grow. I knelt down near the back row, where we once talked about adding marigolds to keep the bugs away. I never got around to it, not while he was sick, not after, until now. I'd picked up a packet from the hardware store the week before. Marigolds, orange and gold, Ben's favorite colors on fall Sundays. Now I dug a small hole. Slow, deliberate, hands dirty by choice. I unfolded Judith's note. Read it one last time. This doesn't change what you did. Then I placed it in the hole. I didn't say a prayer, didn't perform a ritual. I just covered it with soil, then added the marigold seeds, pressed them in, watered them gently, and walked away. I didn't need to rip it up, didn't need fire, didn't need closure through destruction. What I needed was a beginning that didn't start with her. Some people cut ties with scissors. I used a shovel. That afternoon, I sat on the porch. Ben's old flannel over my shoulders, mug in hand. Wind chimes tapped out a soft rhythm above me. No noise from inside. No footsteps from hallways that didn't belong to me. No voices telling me what I owed. Just quiet. And mine. Funny how peace doesn't arrive loud. It shows up like breath returning after holding it too long. I thought about reading her letter again. The sealed one from earlier, still buried in the garden journal drawer. But I didn't. Because I knew how it ended. With her still the victim, me still the villain. Instead, I opened the garden journal, turned to a blank page, and wrote something new. Planted marigolds today. Buried the last of her guilt beneath them. That was the first time I'd written anything in months. It felt like exhaling. Later, I made dinner. Something simple, frozen ravioli, garlic toast. Ben would have made a joke about it being fine dining with zero prep time. I smiled into the silence. After the dishes were washed, I took one last walk through the house. It smelled like lemon cleaner and fresh air now, the way I always liked it. His things were still there, not packed away, not put on display, just existing, like memories you don't have to explain anymore. Before bed, I pulled out the mug, the chipped one, poured a splash of bourbon in it, held it for a while, then raised it slightly. To the end of her story, I whispered, and the start of mine. Outside, the wind rustled the garden bed. No flowers yet, just dirt. But I knew what was coming. I didn't win by screaming. I didn't win by burning anything down. I won by outlasting the version of me they counted on, the one who stayed quiet. And now? She's gone. But the one who stayed? She plants. She protects. She does not apologize. And the next bloom I see, it'll be proof that roots grow stronger in reclaimed ground. The first marigold bloomed the morning after a spring rain. Bright, defiant, unapologetically gold. It poked through the dirt like it had been waiting for me to stop asking for permission to exist. I stood on the porch in Ben's old flannel, coffee in hand, watching that flower hold its own against the wind. Something in me settled, not in a loud, cinematic way, just quiet. Like a chapter had turned, and I hadn't even noticed the page flip. The house didn't feel haunted anymore. Not by grief, not by guilt, not by the silence I used to wrap myself in like armor. It felt like mine. Not because a judge said so, not because of a notarized document, but because I'd stopped asking to be let in. I vacuumed the rug that still held Ben's boot prints, scrubbed the bathroom grout, reorganized the pantry. Not because anyone was coming, because I was. I was returning to my life like someone who had finally been invited back to their own story. I didn't throw away Judith's casserole dish, but I didn't return it either. I placed it high up in the cabinet above the fridge, the one too tall for me to reach without a step stool. Let it sit up there with the other things I don't need, but can't quite throw away. The letter she left in the drawer, still unopened. I dusted around it, didn't touch it, didn't let it own me. Some wounds don't need salt or stitches, just distance. A few days later, I walked into the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. The sunlight was slanting across the floorboards in strips, hitting the spot where Ben used to kick off his boots and leave them like he might need to run out the door at any minute. They weren't there anymore, but the outline in my mind hadn't faded. I closed my eyes. For a long time, I'd thought healing meant erasing the hurt, scrubbing it down to nothing, but now I understood. Healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering without needing to flinch. I opened the drawer on my nightstand. The one with his watch, his pocket knife, the photo of us from that one trip to Asheville when everything felt so stupidly light. I smiled. Not because I missed him less, but because I finally remembered who I was when he loved me. And she was worth protecting. I spent that afternoon painting the back door, a deep, soft green. Ben had always wanted to repaint it, but never settled on a color. I picked one that reminded me of fresh basil and early April grass. Something alive, something growing. When the last coat dried, I stepped back and whispered, "It's done." Not the paint. The story, the season, the war. I didn't throw a party, didn't post anything online, didn't call friends for applause. Some victories are private, and that makes them stronger. That night, I lit a candle. Not because I was sad, but because it was quiet, and the room deserved to feel warm again. As I sat on the porch again, dusk curling around the house like a prayer, I whispered into the dark, "I kept it all, Ben. I really did. Not just the deed, not just the garden. I kept the US that mattered. And I kept me." The wind moved through the wind chimes, soft and steady. I didn't cry. I just breathed, like the house, still standing, still breathing, still mine. And I thought, they thought they kicked me out, but all they really did was free me. Some stories don't end with closure. They end with ownership, not of walls, not of land, but of truth, of breath, of name. This house still breathes like me, and I won't ever be written out again.